Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Monet, what other races are you keeping an eye on, and what should listeners keep in mind when they are watching the results on those come in tonight?
Well, there are a couple of governor's races that are taking place today in deep red states, at least at the national level, and I'm thinking of Kentucky and Mississippi. So these are a couple of states that Donald Trump won in 2020 by big margins, about 17% in Mississippi and 26% in Kentucky. And yet they both still have interesting gubernatorial races, I think because of the specific qualities of the candidates who are running. So to start with Kentucky, there you have a Democratic incumbent who's actually quite popular. That's Andy Beshear. He won in 2019 by defeating Matt Bevin, who was known as a kind of severe conservative, very hard-edged, in a way that put him out of step even with local Republicans and made him quite unpopular in the state and easy to attack. And Andy Beshear has managed to govern in a way that has appealed to a lot of moderates in that state. But his big liability really is the COVID lockdowns. Like a lot of Democrats in 2020, when COVID struck, he thought the way to beat it and the way to appeal broadly to his constituents was to enforce very severe, long-lasting lockdowns. And I think that ended up eroding some of the goodwill that he had built up with the people of the state. And so he's a little bit vulnerable. And he's running against Daniel Cameron, who is a pretty ideal challenger and the sort of candidate who a lot of nationwide Republicans want to see successful and potentially become a national political figure. Daniel Cameron is 37 years old. He's Black. He's the Attorney General of the state. And he is essentially trying to be the anti-Matt Bevin, a very polished, a very presentable candidate who is going to be popular with conservatives in the state because he supports traditional Republican Party priorities, but also appeals a lot more to moderates because he simply embraces an optimistic Reaganite message. And if you look at the direction of the race, it has tightened quite a lot. Beshear, again, was very popular throughout the state and a few months ago was leading by about a 10% margin in most polls. The most recent Emerson poll that came out just about a week ago shows Daniel Cameron with about a 1-point lead. And so, again, in some of these state polls, there aren't too many polls being done, and it can be difficult to trust the accuracy of the numbers. But a directional swing that wide in such a short period of time suggests that as more people are taking a look at Daniel Cameron, they're seeing this is someone who better represents Kentucky, and there's a good chance that he'll be able to pull off a victory in Tuesday's elections. And then the other state, I think, to make a good comparison with Kentucky would be Mississippi, where you have an incumbent Republican who, despite having governed fairly successfully with tax cuts and low unemployment and a growing economy, is fairly unpopular because of a recent scandal that involves the state's welfare office. So it was revealed within the past year that Republicans over the past 2 gubernatorial administrations had been funneling welfare money to well-connected folks. Most famously, Brett Favre, of course, who's a Mississippi native. He got $5 million to finance a volleyball facility at the University of Southern Mississippi, where his daughter happens to play volleyball. And that was only the beginning. So Tate Reeves is implicated in this. He denies any involvement, but it's something that has eroded his popularity. And he's running against a fellow named Brandon Presley, who happens to be the second cousin of Elvis Presley. So you get a little bit of a name recognition bump out of that. But he's running a fairly savvy campaign in that he is focused on expanding Medicaid in the state, which is important because Mississippi is the poorest state in the nation, I think, by quite a lot. And so there are a lot of people who, even if they have conservative instincts, are interested in making those sorts of benefits available to more low-income people. And Presley also is pro-life. He has embraced Mississippi's ban on abortion and is trying to distance himself from national Democrats in that way. And so I think he's really taking a page out of the playbook of John Bel Edwards, who was the former governor from Louisiana next door, who was also pro-life and was able to build up support for moderates in that state because of that. And so it still looks as if Reeves is leading by a fairly big margin and is likely to gain re-election in Tuesday's election. It will be revealing the outcomes of both states in terms of how Democrats try to see if they can appeal to moderate voters in some of these conservative states that vote for Republicans in national elections by very big margins.
Let's move up to Ohio, where abortion is directly on the ballot with Issue 1. Here's a piece of the ballot language. The proposed amendment would establish in the Constitution of the state of Ohio an individual right to one's own reproductive medical treatment, including but not limited to abortion. It says that it would prohibit the state from directly or indirectly burdening, penalizing, or prohibiting abortion before an unborn child is determined to be viable, unless the state demonstrates that it is using the least restrictive means. Several other bullet points there. Let's start with a clip of Ohio's popular governor, Mike DeWine, on Fox News Sunday, urging a no vote on Issue 1.
If you look at Issue 1, it's a radical proposal, and whether you're pro-choice or pro-life, it just goes much, much too far. It would enshrine in our Constitution the right to have an abortion up until birth, so at any time during the pregnancy. The second thing it would do is really threaten a law that we've had on the books for many years that requires parental consent if we're dealing with a minor. So the lawyers who wrote this were very mindful for what they were doing. It is a radical proposal. It does not fit Ohio.
Kate, the argument against Issue 1 that I'm hearing is that it goes beyond Roe v. Wade, and it is not always clear from the ballot language that that is the case. And to take one of the examples that Governor Wine brought up, so again, the language says the state cannot directly or indirectly burden, penalize, or prohibit abortion. And the argument that Governor DeWine is making is we have a parental notification law for minors in this state, and if this gets added to the state constitution, would our judiciary read that parental notification law as a penalty or a burden on abortion? But it is also notable that these are the same kinds of arguments that you've seen made in other states, like recently in Michigan, which passed a similar constitutional amendment, and it seems that that was not persuasive to voters because that got over the majority hurdle anyway.
Right. I mean, that's a question that the courts would have to sort out. But I think perhaps a larger question on this referendum is whether the people of Ohio want this issue taken away from their representatives in the legislature. I mean, one confounding thing about Ohio's views on abortion is, remember, Mike DeWine supported a Harvey bill, a 6-week abortion limitation, and managed to win re-election by a wide margin. So the views of the public on abortion in Ohio are hardly beyond dispute. But what we see here is that what Democrats can't get done in the legislature, they try to use the ballot referendum process to do so. And that's a common tactic. We've seen it on things like Medicaid expansion and other examples of it. But it also would preclude a later change of public opinion on this issue, which is, I just don't think voters want to cede that right on a ballot initiative. But it tends to be successful. These ballot initiatives tend to get through even when a legislature would decline to do the same thing. So I think that there is a real risk there on the issue. But I think, again, Democrats think that they have found a political winner in putting abortion on the ballot. They're thinking about doing it in states like Arizona just to turn out voters and get them to the polls. So I think this is another play here to that effect, but we'll see whether it works.
Let me save a little breath here for the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, which is getting a new justice to replace the late Justice Max Baer. And as Pennsylvania has partisan Supreme Court elections, the two candidates are Republican Carolyn Carluccio and Democrat Daniel McCaffery. And this is worth watching nationally for two reasons. One is I think this could be another bellwether on whether abortion remains a motivating issue for Democratic voters. The last Supreme Court election was narrowly won by the Republican in 2021. And although Pennsylvania is not one of these states that has changed its laws after the fall of Roe v. Wade, there's a Democratic governor who would oppose that. The Democratic candidate for this judicial seat is running hard on abortion rights, saying that he will defend them. The other reason is that Pennsylvania has been a sticking point potentially in national elections for the last two election cycles, particularly because of its mail ballot rules and litigation over which ballots should be counted and which ballots should not be counted. The most recent one was a week before the 2022 election. Because of the death of Justice Baer, there was a 3-3 stalemate about ballots that voters neglected to write a date on, as state law requires them to do. And so the state court said that those ballots would be set aside, and then there would be future litigation potentially over whether to count them or not. And Monet, to my mind, that is a real problem for an election system. If you get to a point where a candidate that is losing by 50 votes can go to the courts and say, well, look over there, we have a pile of votes that are not counted. I would like you to count those, please, because we want people to have their exercise of franchise. The judiciary should lean towards counting those ballots and potentially have the courts decide a winner or a loser. And so this is one of those cases where I think the state Supreme Court elections maybe have the lowest profile of any races on the ballot in proportion to the amount of power that those seats have and the amount of change of policy that can be affected if those seats go one way or another way.
Right. I do think that the Pennsylvania case gets exactly to the nature of what some of the legitimate conservative complaints coming out of the 2020 election were. Obviously, you had all of these states modifying their election rules and how the ballots would be distributed and counted to accommodate for the COVID restrictions on people actually going to the polls in person. And that led to a lot of these contested outcomes with late arriving ballots. And we were in completely uncharted territory, and it was left in the hands of judges to make a lot of these calls. And you did have contested elections. I think a lot of that has been forgotten in the sense that it's been overshadowed by some of the kookier Trump election conspiracy theories. But there really was an extremely important issue regarding what exactly these protocols would be in some of these states moving out of it, and could we standardize and rationalize some of them. You saw a lot of red states pass laws to standardize these processes in the wake of all of that, and they were criticized harshly for doing so. Democrats attacked a lot of these bills as being somehow trying to suppress voter turnout, when really what they were trying to do is provide consistency and clarity and make sure those decisions are being made by legislatures and governors instead of being made ad hoc by Supreme Court members in these states who are not directly accountable to the people in many cases, nor do they have a popular mandate. And so I do think that it seems unlikely that there's going to be any resolution in a lot of these states that have left these laws open-ended, but it should be clear to voters by now that their choice of Supreme Court justices in their states should have a higher priority than it is often given, and that you'll see potentially that becoming a more visible issue, people thinking about what are the nature of our elections going to be based on the judges who they elect in these elections.
Thank you, Monet and Kate. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.